Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and an honour to be here at MacGill again this year. I look forward to it every year. Not only do I reacquaint myself with the most effective sink or swim, literally hangover cure, to be found on earth at Portnew Pier in the mornings, but equally as importantly, I always learn new things and I hear thoughtful views, mostly from people who want a better politics and government for our country. I'll talk in a little while about what I think is one of the enormously significant political reforms or changes of the present Dáil, but while some people, including many people on Twitter, although that's not quite the same thing, dismiss what goes on here as establishment windbagging, I take the view that the MacGill School and Joe Mulholland can take a great deal of credit for the fact that political reform, thoughtful changes to the way we govern ourselves and the way we run our democracy, has become established as an accepted response to the economic crash and the political failings of recent years, and has become, I think, a demanding imperative for all parties. So I'm delighted to be here. For my part, I promise not to use the same jokes as I did last year, but those of you who were here 2 years ago might find a few familiar things. I think there were three significant political developments so far in the course of 2016. The first was the general election in February, which saw the overwhelming rejection of a government which had overseen a strong economic recovery. For sure, that government had not overseen the return of boom-time prosperity to the entire country, but no government can do that. But the Fine Gael Labour coalition undeniably presided over the return of strong economic growth and the ending of austerity. No, it didn't reverse many of the cuts to public spending budgets, nor the tax increases of the austerity years. But it did see a return to expansionary budgets and the promise of more to come. It regained the fiscal and budgetary independence given up during the Troika period, even if these matters remain, by the democratic decision of the Irish people, things which are subject to European agreement. Incomes had begun to grow, living standards began to rise, jobs were being created at a pretty spanking pace, and consumer confidence had finally firmed up. The government parties lost over 50 seats. I think that should make us reevaluate how electoral politics works. The old wisdom of "it's the economy, stupid" is no longer effective as the single basis for a successful political strategy. Some of the rules about how our politics works appear to have changed. And I think that probably hasn't received as much attention as maybe it should have. The general election didn't just return a very different parliament. It demonstrated that the political centre of gravity has moved somewhat to the left. That's not because huge numbers of left-wing TDs were elected, but rather because the big centre parties, realising where the public mood is at, either before or after the election, have moved to the left themselves. I think the election result should also make those of us who work in the media, especially those of us who try to report on and analyse politics, a bit more wary about the certainty of many of our assumptions, and to realise that the worlds that we live in, geographically and intellectually, are not necessarily shared by all of our fellow citizens. The second event of political significance during the year was the construction, eventually, of a new type of government. The minority administration of Fine Gael and the independents, facilitated by Fianna Fáil through its formal agreement with Fine Gael, is unusual by Irish standards, even if minority governments are quite a common feature of similar countries such as New Zealand, Denmark, Finland and the Netherlands, as Regina averred to. It was certainly not unforeseeable, this development, given the parliamentary arithmetic and the stated unwillingness of Fianna Fáil to enter a coalition government with Fine Gael. Quite why so many people found this hard to understand, I think, is puzzling. The significance of the new government, though, is not so much in its novel construction, but rather its minority status. The lack of a functioning parliamentary majority has transferred in one move a huge amount of power from the executive, the government, to the parliament. Previously, the Dáil has been entirely subject to the whim of the government, which lied to it, whipped it, guillotined it and treated it with contempt, although at least it gave it long holidays. Governments of all political hues behaved in this way because they could, because they had a majority, because it was the accepted way of behaving, and ultimately, just as the government had little respect for the Dáil had little respect for itself either. TDs did what they were told by the whips, because they were afraid of the consequences of disobedience, but also because they put little value on the independent role and status of Parliament. That hasn't all changed overnight, but it has dramatically changed the balance of power between the executive and Parliament. So this government, as Regina will tell you, regularly loses votes. It cannot be assured of getting its way on any matter. It must answer to Parliament when Parliament demands it. And that is a very, very significant check on the power of government. It is also, I submit, how our system of parliamentary democracy is supposed to work. And I'll return a little later to the prospects for how it might work in the future. The third major development of significance in the first half of this year is the British vote to leave the EU. The effects of the British decision to leave, as distinct from the actual departure, which will not happen, I guess, for 2.5 years at least, are only beginning to be felt now and beginning to be understood. Much depends on what Britain wants, and Britain doesn't quite yet know what it wants, even if that is becoming to be a little clearer in recent days with the appointment of a cabinet. Nor do we know yet if Europe is even minded to talk about the possibility of agreeing with Britain what Britain wants. I think it's likely to lead to a redefining of the relationship between North and South and between Ireland and the United Kingdom. It seems certain to lead to a period of deep political and economic uncertainty. Economists predict it will lead to a recession in the UK, which will inevitably have an effect here. It has already led to several outbreaks of heebie-jeebies in the markets, as we market analysts say. So what, you say? The markets are jumpy. So what? Well, here's what. Ireland has a national debt of 200 billion. That debt mountain has to be constantly refinanced. Countries tend not to repay their borrowings, they just keep servicing the debt, and the cost of servicing the debt depends on market sentiment. So only when we don't have to borrow on the debt markets can we afford to be insouciant about their heebies and their jeebies. I think over the longer term, the economic and political effects of Brexit are likely to strengthen the necessity for fiscal discipline in how Ireland constructs its budgets. That will be enforced by the European laws that we approved in a referendum, and also by the need to keep on the right side of markets. And I think that in turn means we are in for a period of semi-permanent, semi-tight budgets. I should admit at this stage, and as you no doubt remember, I also predicted this here last year and was partly vindicated when the government produced a relatively restrained budget package last October amounting to a €1.5 billion giveaway. Unfortunately, they wriggled out of my prediction by rather sneakily passing supplementary estimates for last year of another 1.5 billion, thus inflating the budget package in real terms to over 3 billion. They were duly punished by the electorate for defying my prediction, a lesson, I think, for the current administration. In fact, that election budget notwithstanding, the previous governments, and by all accounts its successor, have been reasonably restrained when growth returned. When you think that spending during the latter part of the boom period was being increased at the rate of 12 to 14% a year, the present government's apparent determination to keep spending growth to something around the 3% range looks reasonably prudent. Of course, were they to adopt a different course and seek to respond to the many and very often deserving needs for further spending on health, on social welfare, on public education, on public sector pay, on election studies, they would pretty soon run into trouble with both the European Commission and the markets. So let them make a virtue of necessity. It's hardly the worst thing a government can do. But this semi-permanent period of semi-tight budgets will have an effect on our politics. It means, I think, that one of the central questions of Irish politics will be whether this new politics can catch up with the new fiscal reality. As an aside, I think one further consequence of Brexit is that the lives of many senior civil servants, and especially of our diplomats, are going to get a lot more difficult and a lot more complicated. In a review of Eamon Gilmore's book for the Post, I once made a slightly unkind joke about the Department of Foreign Affairs. Mr Gilmore was singing the praises of the Irish diplomatic service as the greatest diplomatic service in the world. And I observed that I didn't think it was possible for anyone to have a higher estimation of the abilities of the Department of Foreign Affairs than the department itself did. But Mr Gilmore appeared to have it. Like all decent jokes, there was a grain of truth in it. But I think that now practically nothing is more important for this country than its diplomats and senior civil servants get results in the negotiations which are already beginning. They have a very difficult job to do, and I hope for all our sakes that they do it well. So how will these developments affect our politics and governance in the years ahead? Putting on my Mystic Meg robes and looking into the crystal ball, I see two questions, an inevitability and a challenge. One of the immediate questions is whether the independent TDs who have entered government can satisfactorily acclimatise themselves to the demands and the responsibilities of government office. The signs of late aren't great. My strong sense is that most of the independents want to stay in government for the medium term at least. But whether they are prepared to make the compromises and the political sacrifices that this requires, whether they are prepared to say no to people they have always had the luxury of saying yes to when in opposition, whether they can demonstrate that they appreciate and have internalised the difference between campaigning and governing, I don't know the answer to that. But the answer to that question will determine the future of this government. The second question for the immediate future is whether the impact the second question will be exactly what impact the departure of the Taoiseach has on the stability of the government. You can all ask him yourselves later on, I suppose, but my expectation is that Mr Kenny is likely to have a lot more time on his hands by next summer. I think that Fine Gael's recent bout of the collywobbles about Fianna Fáil pulling the plug on it at the earliest opportunity is based on a misreading, again, by Fianna Fáil of Fine Gael, just as they did on the coalition question after the election. Fine Gael really needs to get better at reading its chief rivals. But there's no doubt that Mr Kenny's departure will change the dynamic in government between the independents and Fine Gael, between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And at the very least, it's a potentially destabilising event for the government. The inevitability I see is that over the medium-term future there will be cooperation between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael inside government. The obvious policy compatibility on a range of issues and the decline of traditional party loyalty, though it is far from dead, it is much less powerful a force in our politics than it was, mean that the two old enemies will at some stage in the not too distant future find themselves in a coalition government together. We know that Fine Gael is already hot to trot. Fianna Fáil, I think, will come around to the idea. I say this as somebody who said, he adds modestly, all along that Fine Gael would not join a coalition after the last election. I base this judgment on contacts with the party's grassroots in the wake of the election, when they stressed how different they were to Fine Gael. Never mind that the differences weren't that obvious to those of us on the outside. The important thing was they believed the parties were different, and they resented the idea that there was no difference between them. But what many of them said to me was, not never ever, but rather what they said was, not now. So I think it will prove to be. And finally, to the challenge. I referred earlier to the way that the minority status of the government has greatly increased the power of the Dáil. I think in the last few months, the Dáil has been feeling its way into this new power. Fianna Fáil has been seeking to tread a careful line between facilitating the functioning of government and exercising its own newfound power. The independents in government are clearly only getting used to it. In fact, everyone is still only getting used to it. We shouldn't underestimate the extent to which everyone is making this up as they go along. I think it very much remains to be seen if the newly empowered Dáil uses that power properly and productively. There is, to say the least of it, a significant possibility that the power of Parliament will be used not for ensuring accountability from the government, for collaborative legislating, for true debate over the best course of action for our country. Rather, there is every chance that the newfound power of Parliament will be used for obstruction, for tactical political manoeuvring, and for windy grandstanding. I've stood here before and told you how we are responsible for the politicians we elect, and how ultimately politicians act rationally by doing what their electorates want them to do, and how many of us persistently choose to reward those who think only of the local rather than the local and the national, who view it as their primary role to attain cabinet office so as to divert resources to their own electorates. I've spoken about how blaming politicians alone for our political mismanagement gives us, the electorate, a free pass from the consequences of our own democratic choices. And I don't resile from any of that. But I think that in the new politics, which is really just the old politics without a Dáil majority, the new Dáil, for all that it has assumed greater power and a greater centrality in political and governmental decision-making, now has a greater responsibility as well. With responsibility, after all, comes power. That will be the true test of the so-called new politics, and it is an enormous challenge for the new Dáil. Let's see how they get on with budget making. Let's see how they get on with fights over public sector pay. Let's see how they get on with third-level funding. Do they retreat to populist sloganeering, or do they try to work out policies that aren't perfect but are reasonably fair and fairly affordable? If the Dáil passes this test, and we shouldn't in fairness judge it immediately, it's going to take a while to get the hang of this thing, we will have a better politics, a more successful democracy and a better government. But if it fails, if the Dáil flunks this historic and vital challenge, I would really wonder about our ability to govern ourselves well. Thank you.